Hi, my name is Anna Hoffman, and welcome to this session called Azure SQL What to Use When. I'm a data and applied scientist / program manager on the Azure Data team focusing on Azure SQL. I'm really excited to be here today from my home to share with you some of the deployment options as well as what to choose when. And as well as talking about the deployment options, we'll also talk about some of the different service tiers. So you'll learn about things like Serverless and Hyperscale and some use cases for why you might choose one over the other for some of the other options. So as I mentioned, this session is called Azure SQL What to Use When, and it's part of SQL Bits 2020. Now, before we get started, I wanted to give an overview of Azure SQL and what is it that we're talking about when we talk about Azure SQL. Really, there's three main deployment options we're talking about. The first is SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine. Now, think about it like this. What happens here is it's just SQL Server running on a virtual machine, except that virtual machine is running under our Azure infrastructure. So this means that you don't have to worry about the infrastructure or the hardware, but you do have to worry about things like the OS as well as the SQL Server. So you can get any version of SQL Server and any OS, but that also means you're responsible for those things. We call this infrastructure as a service, or IaaS. Now, if we abstract away the OS and say, I don't care about the OS, I just want a SQL Server, and I want some of the management capabilities that Azure provides. That's where Azure SQL Managed Instance comes into the picture, because this is really going to give you a managed SQL Server. So you're not going to have to worry about the OS, you are going to have to manage the SQL Server, but you do get some platform as a service, or PaaS benefits, like it being versionless SQL. And then if you abstract one layer higher than that, you get Azure SQL Database. And like the name suggests, you don't have to manage the OS or the SQL Server. You kind of just get a database and you can get up and running. And we say this is best for modern cloud applications. And this is where you're going to find options like Serverless and Hyperscale today. So that's platform as a service as well. Okay, so now let's go into each of these options and kind of see some challenges and solutions and some key differentiators. Now, the first deployment option I want to talk about is SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine. Now, this is going to provide the promise of the cloud while maintaining OS control. So why do customers move to this? Well, we see customers on a variety of scenarios. One, maybe the contract on their hardware is expiring and they're looking to lift and shift into Azure very quickly. Two, believe it or not, some of our customers are still running SQL Server 2008 and 2008 R2, which have reached end of support. Maybe you have dependencies on being next to the OS or dependencies on SSRS or things that just aren't supported in Azure today as an Azure service. Now for this, you can just get a VM with the OS you need, so you can specify whether that's Linux or Windows and the SQL Server version you need. And if you have third-party applications that, for example, might need access to that OS, this is really going to be the best option for you. So we talked about some of the things that are supported. Again, in this case, it really is just SQL Server. So you're going to get everything, with SQL Server 2019 that you would expect to get with SQL Server 2019. Now, there are some Azure differentiators for why you might want to move to SQL Server and a VM. You get free extended security updates for those end of support resources that are on 2008 or 2008 R2, so that can help for a few years. You can also get some automated features like automated backups and security updates. You can also implement things like point-in-time restore with Azure Backup, and you can actually get accelerated storage performance if you set up something like Azure Blob Caching, and you have all the options to scale up and scale down within different VM size to kind of meet your workload appropriately. Now, one customer I like to talk about when we talk about, SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine is Allscripts. And I like to talk about them because they were basically able to use Azure Site Recovery to fail over about 600 virtual machines in a matter of weeks. And then they were up and running very quickly. Now, what I like about them as well is they kind of took a phased approach to migration. So after they, migrated to SQL Server and Azure VM, they started to evaluate if some of those instances could actually go to Azure SQL Managed Instance, which is more of a platform as a service offering. And so they kind of took a phased approach to migration, which I found very interesting. Okay, so let's shift from talking about IaaS or infrastructure as a service and talk about platform as a service or PaaS. And that's really where we're going to spend the rest of our time in this session, is diving deeper into PaaS, the offerings, and the service tiers. So let's start with Azure SQL Managed Instance. Now, why did we come up with this, and why is this something that you're seeing a lot of customers use? We saw a lot of people that wanted to migrate to something like Azure SQL Database, but they needed some instance scoped features. So instance scope features include things like CLR, database mail, machine learning services, service broker, and SQL Server agent. Those sort of things you're only going to get in Azure SQL Managed Instance or SQL Server, but you're not going to get those instance scoped features in Azure SQL Database because you're just getting a database. So that was a big reason that we came up with Azure SQL Managed Instance. It has a much higher level of feature parity with SQL Server, and you can also get things like native virtual network support and some interesting things we've done around Azure AD in even the recent weeks and even at Ignite last week. Now, what are some Azure differentiators? Okay, so we have some ways to help you get migrated using, an online migration with very little downtime using the database migration service. We can also give you kind of the best of SQL Server with the best of having a managed service. Things like availability groups, geo restores, that sort of thing is something you're going to get out of the box if you want it with Azure SQL Managed Instance without too much configuration. Now, if we talk about a customer, I like to talk about Komatsu because they were able to very smoothly and easily migrate a pretty sizable database to Azure SQL Managed Instance with hardly any code changes. And what's really powerful here is the cost reduction and performance gains that they were able to see almost immediately. You see, 49% cost reduction and 25 to 30% performance gain. So that's pretty significant. All right, so we talked about Azure SQL Managed Instance. Now let's talk about Azure SQL Database. And this is, the first cloud offering that we came out with as a company, and there are really a lot of options within it. So there are a lot of challenges that customers face that might lead them to this deployment options. So let's talk about a few of those challenges. One might be customers want to build a multi-tenanted software as a service or SaaS type of application. Now, Azure SQL Database has an option called Elastic Pools, which is going to allow you to cost optimize and share resources between databases. Now, in Azure SQL Managed Instance, you can get an instance pool, but Elastic Pools are really more meant for this type of multi-tenancy and those sorts of applications. Another reason we see people moving towards Azure SQL Database is if they have an intermittent or unpredictable workload, and that might lead them to the Serverless tier, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Additionally, if they have a lot of data and it, supersedes the amount of data supported in size in Azure SQL Managed Instance, they want to be able to do that. And things like Hyperscale are going to allow them to scale up to, 100 terabytes and potentially even more. With Azure SQL Database, you're also going to be able to get the highest SLA in the industry. That's 99.995% if you use availability zones. And really, that equates to like 26 minutes or less of downtime per year. So that's pretty significant. And a lot of the configuration, as I mentioned, with these platform as a service is done for you. So you just say, I want to enable availability zones. I want, an availability group deployed underneath, and we kind of take care of all that in the management for you. Now, if we talk about a customer, I like to talk about AccuWeather because they really weren't concerned with managing SQL Server. They just wanted to use a great database and start building modern applications. So they were able to very easily spin this up, get their data in, and start connecting it to other services in Azure, like Azure Machine Learning services, as well as Azure Data Factory. So that's a great example, and I'll provide information on, all these customers that we talk about. So now, once we've talked about the deployment options, the next decision that you have to make, at least in the case of Azure SQL Database, is between the DTU model and the vCore model. Now, the DTU model is what we came out with earlier, and this was a way to give you, simplicity, right? So you pick a size, and we're going to give you a certain amount of compute and storage that goes along with that. Now, we made some adjustments and improvements, and we came up with this vCore model, and what that's great for is because you can independently scale your compute and storage. Now, this is our recommendation, and I have two main reasons for that. One is this is going to enable you to leverage Azure Hybrid benefits. So basically, if you already have existing licenses when you move to Azure SQL Database, you can use them here. Additionally, you can also do reserved instances here. And what that basically means is you're going to prepay in advance for a certain amount of resources, and that's going to allow you to get a significant discount. Now, I've mentioned you choose this for Azure SQL Database. For Azure SQL Managed Instance, you don't have this choice. The vCore model is the only model available today. Okay, so now that you kind of know about the purchasing model, so we talked about deployment options, we talked about purchasing models, the next level is the service tier. So we're going to talk about the three main service tiers in the vCore model now. The first is the general purpose service tier. Now, the way you can think about this is kind of like a failover cluster instance. You see on the screen there, your application goes to the control wing where there are some gateways, and then the gateways will point you to your database. And this depends how you configure it, if it goes to the gateway every time, or if it can then be redirected to the database every time. And you can configure that, but we won't get into that here. Okay, so how does this general purpose service tier work? So what happens if you have your TempDB running on your directly attached SSD, but your data and log files are in locally redundant storage or Azure Premium Storage, and your backup files are stored in Azure Standard Storage, or that's read access geo-redundant storage. So right off the bat, you're getting some geo-redundancy. We put your backups in a paired region. So this means if even a whole region goes down, your backups are in another region, and you can use something like geo-restore to go and restore that database up. And that's true across all the service tiers. Now, if a failover needs to occur in the general purpose service tier, like a failover cluster instance, we're going to look for a node with spare capacity, and then we'll kind of fail you over. And the connectivity redirection is going to be built in. So that's kind of the power of PaaS, and I talk about this quite a bit, but that you just pick general purpose and you get all this. Now, general purpose is going to be great for most of our customers. Most of our customers are fine in the general purpose service tier, but what if you need a little bit more? And what if you want to do things like in-memory OLTP or have a higher availability? That's where the business critical service tier comes in. So if you take a look at this architecture, it's very similar if we look at the beginning, except on that primary, what you're getting is the TempDB as well as the data and the log file. So they're all right there, which can reduce the latency a bit. Additionally, behind the scenes, we're deploying an always-on availability group. So you're going to have 3 secondary replicas, and we're actually going to allow you to read from one of those replicas. So that's going to help you get some read scale, or just a little bit of read scale. Like I mentioned, all of our backups for across the service tiers are in Azure Standard Storage, but if a failover needs to occur here, since you have this always-on availability group, failovers can happen very quickly, and you may have seen me do this demo before, but a failover with business critical can take, about 2 seconds, maybe 2 to 5 seconds. So it's very, very fast. And again, you're getting that connectivity redirection built in, so you really don't have to have too much downtime as long as you have retry logic in your applications. Now, the last tier I want to talk about is the Hyperscale Tier. The other tiers are available in Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance. This tier today is only available in Azure SQL Database. I'm not going to get too far into it. There are lots of sessions available on Hyperscale. I definitely recommend you go check it out and learn more about this thing, because we've really re-architected SQL Server to be a cloud-first type of product here. A few things to call out. Now, from a read scale perspective, you can have between 0 and 4 readable secondaries. So in business critical, you can have 1, but in hyperscale, you can have up to 4. So this can really help you with workloads that are really read heavy, and you don't want them to interfere with your write workloads. Additionally, you have your backup stored, and we're using some snapshot technology, which really allows us to do things very quickly. And additionally, the Hyperscale tier has really been able to allow us to take some things that were size of data operations and make them constant time. And this is dependent on a few things that we won't get into, but really this is great if you have a lot of data and you need to be able to store that in Azure in a managed type of way. So let's look at a summary of what we talked about. So I tried to compare them here on the screen. You can kind of see I'm using like a plus or multiple money signs to express, business critical is generally going to be the most expensive tier, but it's the only tier, for example, that's going to support you for in-memory workloads. But with Hyperscale, you can kind of get unlimited storage. You see IOPS, so that's IOPS per second. So what I'm saying here is with business critical, you're going to get the best IOPS in most cases. Also, what I wanted to call out here is those readable replicas. You can have 0 to 4. And then finally, in general purpose in Azure SQL Database only, there's also this thing called Serverless. So I wanted to spend just a moment talking about the Serverless tier. Now, this is really meant for folks who have problems or business applications with challenges with sporadic or unpredictable workloads. So if you take, for example, a line of business application for a bank, maybe an expense reporting application, and it only gets used mostly during the day, but it's kind of unpredictable. Sometimes during the end of the month, there's a lot more expense reports happening and there's a lot more CPU required out of this database. But then during other times, nobody really uses it. And even what you're seeing here is kind of in the middle of the night, no one uses this thing. So what Serverless allows you to do is set an auto pause delay. And so what that means is you can set it to delay, say, after an hour of no activity, we're actually going to shut down SQL Server and separate the compute and the storage entirely. And during that time where the database is paused, you're only going to pay for the storage. Now, there are some performance implications when you start back up because your first connection might fail and then you're starting with a cold cache. But for some workloads, this can actually be a huge cost savings, and we're really seeing great adoption in this space. So we've talked about a lot of deployment options. We talked about SQL Server and Azure VM, we talked about Azure SQL Managed Instance, and we talked about Azure SQL Database. We also talked about some of the service tiers that are available under each of those different offerings. So I want to take a look and show you how we're trying to make it easier for you to make these decisions right from within the Azure Portal. So here in the Azure Portal, what I can do is I can search for Azure SQL. And under Services, if I select Azure SQL, what I'm going to see is all of my Azure SQL resources in one pane of glass. You note I filtered by a subscription, but what I can see is I have SQL MIs, SQL servers, SQL databases, and even SQL virtual machines. In addition, I can see all the different service tiers and kind of, deployments within that I have, whether it's Enterprise Edition on Windows Server 2019 for SQL Server, or whether we have a business critical or a serverless, or even, a hyperscale type of database. So there's a lot of value that you can get just from right in this blade. Additionally, if I click Add, I'm going to get help on what to use when. So you're going to see something that should look kind of similar to what we saw at the beginning of this presentation. And additionally, you can click in and learn more about, for example, where Hyperscale and Serverless lie. Or, I like this benefit a lot, is if you go to virtual machines and you select that drop down, we have every single image and SQL Server version combination that you could think of, whether it's bring your own license, and it goes all the way back to SQL Server 2008 R2 on Windows Server 2008 R2. So hopefully this is something that makes it a little bit easier for you all. Now if I go back to the slides, we can go ahead and wrap up by thinking about this. Satya says Azure is the world's computer. And I like to think, and we like to think on our team, that Azure SQL has evolved into the world's database. So I hope that, through seeing all these options, you're kind of seeing that Azure SQL has the flexibility and the capabilities to meet you wherever it is you are on your journey to the cloud or with SQL, as well as to meet you at the availability, performance, and price point that you need when you need it. There are a lot of resources for you to go learn more. I definitely recommend you check this out. If you're interested in videos like this, you can see Azure SQL for Beginners, a series of 61 videos by Bob Ward and myself, or Data Exposed, where I interview various program managers and engineers on our team to learn more about what they're doing and dive deep into specific demos. You can also try all of this stuff for free on Microsoft Learn in our new learning pathway called Azure SQL Fundamentals. I hope this was useful for you all. I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you for spending time with me. If you want to stay up to date, you can follow us at Azure SQL, or you can follow me at Analytic Anna, and you can see the trends that are happening under the hashtag Azure SQL. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.